thank you all for coming and coming into my session. And if you need more treats, I'm a relaxed speaker. You feel free to go get yourself more treats. And also, I'm a relaxed speaker too. So as if we're going, and you don't have to keep your questions till the end. Feel free to ask, as we're going, as we're talking about something. So they asked me to talk about just preservation of cemeteries in general. As myself as a Catholic, I can say here in Indiana, we don't do a great job of keeping up our Catholic cemeteries, and I hope that this is a part of this will motivate the diocese and the churches to start caring for the cemeteries. Now, a lot of people are like, why cemetery preservation? No one's using that property or that ground, which is something I get told a lot by people, developers and things like that. But cemeteries are as part of our cultural landscape. They're who we are as a people. Again, the size, the shape, the ornamentation is going to vary. Early cemeteries aren't going to have the ornate mourning angels or the crucifixes and things like that. But then you get later, then you get these pieces of artwork that are in there. But no matter what type of art is in the cemetery, the sacred ground, and they're important to our history. And so I think it's important that we keep these cemeteries and keep them respectable. Now, a lot of cemeteries that you're going to have are going to have long-standing issues. I mean, this cemetery here, the person it's a township trustee cemetery, and when he got elected in November and started in January, this is what he inherited. So this is not something that we did. This is something that is long going. In the United States, we just have not cared for our cemeteries the way that I think we should. So this is not something that happened overnight, and so I think it's important to remember that you're not going to fix it overnight. Unless you've got a lot of money that you can hire a company to come in and do the repair work. If you're doing this through slow fundraising and doing a little bit every year, or you're doing it through volunteer work, that it's going to take a while, and that's okay. As long as it's slow progress is better than turning into something like this. And I think the biggest issue is money. I mean, all the preservation, it's going to take money no matter what it is. Whether you're using volunteer work, you're going to have some of the money for some of the materials. If you hire a company and you're like, well, with this, how much is it going to cost in order to take care of something like this? Along with, you might have a cemetery that you're slowly getting, you have to do just general maintenance, general mowing. This is that Jewish cemetery. They're down on the south side. And so, you've got this one, they can't actually mow this cemetery. They actually have to weed eat it because the stones are so close together. And it's 7 or 8 acres. And they are weed eating by hand. That takes time. Yeah, that takes lots of time and lots of money. And then if you've got buildings or pieces of architecture along with your cemetery, then you've got even more money. Plus, you're also got your churches that you're worried about. And so money's going to be an issue, and I understand that. And again, that's why I'm going to be a strong advocate of utilizing volunteers, and we'll talk about some projects that your volunteers could work on later as I progress through the talk.
Is that the result of vandalism, or what? How come the cemeteries are in this bad shape?
This first one here. Yes, this is vandalism. It's both vandalism and I call custodial care. And a lot of times, a lot of the damage that happens in a cemetery is from the mower deck. It's a 3-foot mower deck, and heaven forbid that our pioneer ancestors didn't put the stones 3.5 feet from each other so that they could just mow through on their riding lawnmower. And so then they come through with their mower every time and hit that stone and continually hit it, and eventually it's going to snap and break. I kind of equate it when you vacuum, and when you're vacuuming at home and you hit the corner of your couch, eventually you're going to chip out the leg of your couch. Same thing with the tombstones. These mower decks come through, and if someone doesn't care and is just kind of doing it at their own speed. This is in Johnson County. Just if you know where the Greenwood Park Mall is, this is the Greenwood Park Mall. It's just not too far from there. Actually, it's been restored. When I get done, I've got the after shot I can show you. This has actually been restored. They actually spent the money to restore it. When we went in there to start working in there were no complete standing stones. There are 150 now, complete standing stones.
Is this an abandoned cemetery?
There's no legal definition of abandoned cemetery, so I don't use it. What this is, it's closed. It's no longer open for burials, and it's the responsibility of the township trustee. But I don't use the word abandoned because sometimes abandoned to you is neglect to me, and to someone else so there's just all these different in sense there's no legal definition.
Referring to the legal tie between the cemeteries that really need work and the responsibility of the trustee.
Yeah, the trustees are responsible for, in Indiana. Is anybody not from Indiana? Okay, because I know Indiana law, I don't know, Michigan or something like that. But in Indiana, a township trustee is responsible for cemeteries that no taxes are being paid on the property. There's no viable organization like a church that would be paying property taxes. And it's established before February 19th, 1939. And that date has to do with when the law was passed. So like this cemetery here is an older cemetery, established in the 1800s. No one's paying property taxes, and there's no cemetery association. So it became the responsibility of the township trustee. But a person can own a cemetery in Indiana. So like a farmer could own the cemetery if they're paying property taxes on it, a church or something like that. And so even if they're not caring for it, it's not the responsibility of the township trustee to take over it. So that's why that word abandon can kind of be tough, because for some people it means neglect, but for other people it's just nobody taking care of it or not responsible for it or anything like that.
You know all the cemeteries in the state then, just not
Yes.
in Marion County.
Yeah, I work
County.
I'm a state employee, and as the state employee for the Department of Natural Resources, my job is to identify every cemetery in the state. And then also, since we're out there, doing identification and location and size and shape, I also do some consultation on cemetery preservation and stuff. So yeah, so I work in the entire state.
Just a little, maybe two or three tombstones constitute.
A cemetery is any place there's any person in any part of decomposition. So whether it's one person, whether or not there's a tombstone there, as long as there's the body there, it's a cemetery in the state of Indiana.
The reason I ask is I saw a little tiny three, it looked like a personal, down Brown County, I think, somewhere. And it was just a tombstone, and looked like a couple or three people there. So that would be...
That's a cemetery. And in Indiana, especially southern Indiana, you get more smaller tombstone or more smaller cemeteries. Because of the topography of the land, it was difficult to get someone out to bury them. But then if you go into northern Indiana, there are just fewer cemeteries, but they're larger. Because it's flat ground, it's easy to get them out there. Bill, you had a question?
Yeah. I was on the first wave in the 70s of doing the county inventories.
Mm-hmm.
My directive was not to look at cemeteries. Well, I disregarded that directive.
And I thank you for that.
And the reason being is, I knew this, even when I was still a neophyte. It's an important part of the cultural landscape. And cemeteries are architectural, even if there's no building, just look at the stones.
Yes.
So I disregarded my orders and recorded the cemeteries, every one, even when the USGS map said there was one deep inside of a woods.
Mm-hmm.
I would go ask the owner and say, whereabouts is that? Because I wanted to go look at it. I wanted to document it anyway.
And today when we do the county surveys, which is a program that my office runs, and we hire people to drive every road in a county and document bridges, buildings, cemeteries, they today get every cemetery. So we have changed our methodology and realized that cemeteries are important. I'll say that partly that's because I'm in the office and I just took over and said we're going to do this, and so.
I'm glad to see that change because, I grew up going to cemeteries.
Yes.
That's where you find your ancestors.
It's where you find your ancestors, and you're right. The architecture and the art and that above ground, we call it an outdoor museum basically, is an amazing thing and needs to be documented. And so we're working on those too.
So I always try to find the oldest stone and the most recent stone to establish that.
That's how we establish the dates. Yes. Yep. It's why I loved working with the county surveys that you worked on.
Glad someone finally said that.
And then we've got knowledge. We had a very well-meaning people who go out into the cemeteries and do some things that are just, we're going to call it rough. This cemetery is down in southern Indiana, and every time I go to Madison, I pass this cemetery, and it just makes me sad. They are very well-meaning. I've actually spoken to them. I went to the church. It's associated with a Baptist church, and I went in one day and I said, "So what'd you guys do to your cemetery?" It was more like, "Why?" was my question. They thought they were doing good. They were trying to clean up their cemetery, but they have done everything wrong in this cemetery. So the first thing they did is, and I'm not sure why, they poured concrete over this entire burial area and put a flagpole in the middle. That flagpole's in the middle of a grave. So you've got this concrete that's now just fallen apart because it's a mess. they lined up these people, the tombstones, put them in concrete. Concrete is bad, 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 because concrete is stronger than stone. And you think it's hard as rock, that means it's going to last forever, but stone is very fragile and it's porous. And so with this one, if that mower deck came through and hit the stone, it's going to break before the concrete will. And so they've lined these people up. First off, they're not buried this close together. So they've taken stones from other parts of the cemetery, probably out in here and stuff like that, and lined them all up. So now we don't know where anybody's buried. Instead of fixing the stones that are broken, they've just put them back to front. So these pieces down here, this is probably one stone that's a tall tablet. And so instead of putting it back together, they have just put them together. And getting cement off of tombstones is hard. We have a cemetery preservation workshop, and we had this little baby stone, and I'm like, I'll chip the concrete off of it. I broke the baby stone. So, because the concrete is so intense. And so they've, did that. And actually, and if you'll also look up over here, they've just piled a bunch of stones up here around this one. So again, they were well-meaning. They were trying to take care of their cemetery. I'm sure it's also easier to mow. This is much easier to mow now and things like that. But again, they've kind of screwed some things up. And so that's why we encourage classes. There are lots of classes in the state of Indiana. My office offers a class every year. It's usually in May. Here in Indianapolis, it's a day-and-a-half class. And what I'll do is I'll offer this today is if any of you want to take the class, I always get free spots. I'll give you a free spot. So if the Lafayette Diocese wants to send someone to the cemetery preservation class, we'll offer that to you for free. So that way you guys can come, can learn the right techniques. We also talk about laws, things like that. But there are other classes. I was actually in Richmond last night, and they were doing a class yesterday. So there's classes all over the state. I'm just a big advocate of getting the knowledge so that you don't become a part of my PowerPoint presentation. And then there's other concerns. What's more important, the cows and the farming or the stone? Now, not even technically. In Indiana, this is illegal. It's illegal to farm through a cemetery, and it's illegal to have cows and animal husbandry in a cemetery. The problem is that DNR is not a prosecutorial agency, and so when we find out that there's something like this going on, we notify the county prosecutor, and the county prosecutor is supposed to prosecute this. Well, in this case, the county prosecutor went, and didn't prosecute anybody because he didn't think it was a big deal. This farmer, he's like, well, he should have the right to have his cattle where he wants. And so you have this cemetery that's got some severe damage and is, cows and horses and stuff are kind of brutal to stones because they like to rub up against them, scratch your back kind of a thing, and they'll knock them over and then step on them too. If it's a tablet and a cow or a horse steps on them, it breaks it, it shatters it pretty easily. And then also other concerns are things like what's more important, the cemetery, or this is I-69 and 465 up on the northeast side of Indianapolis, and they're going to make, I always tease, they're going to make this into like a 75-lane interchange, but they moved the cemetery in order to widen the road, and that's something that's very popular. Is our two biggest movers of cemeteries are NDOT and coal companies. They'll move cemeteries to do more coal work. This cemetery actually I thought was moved in the most respectful way that this possible. It was NDOT did this about 3 or 4 years ago. They did it through archaeology, so they found all of everybody, made sure they found all the coffin parts and clothing and anything that was left, moved them out to Crown Hill, and they're actually buried in the same grave orientation and next to the same people that they were here. So, and they actually found some unmarked graves, and so we were able to mark those graves now out at Crown Hill. But it's not uncommon to move cemeteries.
Was that a contractor that did that work?
Yes, it was AMEC, yep. They do a lot of that. And I think they do a very nice job. They put up a tent so that you couldn't have looky-loos looking as they were driving by and trying to see the graves. They were very, very respectful on the move. They actually, out at Crown Hill, hand-dug the graves because these were hand-dug graves. I know other people who would have just taken the backhoe and dug it that way. But unfortunately, they did it during kind of one of the droughts, so it was rough for them. But they continued. They hand dug all. There's 18 graves, and they hand dug all 18 graves. They actually were able to identify some of the people. They knew that there was a Civil War soldier out there who had been injured during one of the battles, And so one of the unmarked graves, they could see through the bone that the bone had been repaired and so they knew that was that soldier. They were able then to mark his grave. So they did, I think, a very nice job on this one. Yeah.
Do they have to notify families, or how is the family involved in this process?
Okay, well, unfortunately, family has no say in this. When I say family, immediate family does. So a spouse, a parent, or a child. So if they're going to move my grandparents' grave, I have no say over that. But if they're going to move my parents' grave, my husband's grave, or my child's grave, I can fight that. Then what they have to do is they have to go through a court. They have to go through the court system and get permission to move the graves. And the court requires a variety of different things, that they have to prove why they need to move it and things like that. Once they get that the permission from the court, then the State Department of Health gives a permit, and then the permit offers 2 ways to move. You can move it through a funeral home director or through an archaeologist. Personally, I prefer the archaeologist because I believe they get all of everything. They get all of the dirt that changes colors, because when you die and you decompose and you change the color of the soil. So they take all of that soil because that's part of you, and then they'll move it. Funeral home directors, not necessarily, because they're not used to dealing with graves from the 1850s. And then they move it, and they have to move it to an active cemetery. And then some cemeteries, like this one, each person got their own grave again. I've seen others where they've put everybody into one grave because there's not much left. So, but the law doesn't say how many graves for how many graves you had or anything like that. You just have to move it into an active cemetery.
Do they try to reach out to family members just to let them know? So somebody in California come visit Great Aunt Lucy.
Right. Yes. And then she's not there anymore. So 2 things. We've got a couple things here. First is they have to put some ads in the paper. But have you ever seen a legal ad in the paper? It's about that big. And if you don't read legal ads, because I certainly don't read legal ads in the paper here, you may not catch it. I don't. NDOT on this one, again, NDOT did this right on so many levels. They actually reached out to the family and tried to find descendants and things like that, because they did a rededication out at Crown Hill and had the family there. So they did, but most don't. So then you come back from California and you're trying to find the cemetery. What do you do? Well, we have a cemetery registry, which I will talk about right now. It's we have a card here about it. It's called SHARD. It stands for the State Historic Archaeology and Architecture Resource Database. And it's a list of all known historic resources in the state. So it's not just cemeteries. There's a bridge inventory. There's the county surveys. There are buildings, are all now available online. So if you came to this is called the White Cell Cemetery. So if you came out to the White Cell Cemetery and you're like, where is this? If you went onto the database and you looked up the White Cell Cemetery, it will tell you where it got moved to and when. So we're lucky in Indiana to have that database and that inventory of cemeteries, and we keep track of where cemeteries used to be, where they got moved to. So all the cemeteries. No. Yeah, you would have to.
Show up, it's not there, the road's there.
Well, hopefully then you go to the library. Yeah. Well, hopefully you go to the library and you ask the people at the local library what happened, and I work a lot with the libraries in the state, and they tell you, hey, this is available. Hopefully. Otherwise, yes, it is. Yeah, it's tough because.
That would have been respectful. I saw this on the news, and I was very familiar with that way back before any of this interstate was, and I thought the way they did it was fine, and like Bob said, reaching out to the families and whatever, and somebody from California shows up, there should be some kind of a marker, something near there that says, hey, we removed these, they're at Crown Hill Cemetery, they're in lot 42, section such and such. So, I don't know how old the people would be to come, but if you're looking for your ancestors, like this gentleman said, you might be a teenager. A lot of people don't know all this. Go to the library.
Right.
Are you serious? We don't even write no more.
Just sure.
It's
Yes.
computery. I mean,
I understand. Yes, I understand your.
And we
yes.
don't care about the past. We don't care about
That's.
ancestors. We don't care about history.
Yep.
We just care about what we want to do. We're putting in this interstate, and we're going to do what we want to do.
Yes.
And
so
I don't like the government's attitude and that kind of thing when it comes to historical and preservations and respect to people We're the only human beings on earth,
Yep.
and then nobody wants to respect anybody.
And unfortunately, it's not just the government. I think it's us as I mean, developers,
Well,
it's
you're here with the government, or you're
Yeah.
with your agency, so. Yeah.
Is this the cemetery before the?
Before the move,
Before
yes.
they're moved? Is the road on top of these?
Not
this
yet.
site?
It will. The road will be on top of this when.
So if we put up that marker, it'll be between some lanes out of the.
Well, it'd have to be off the edge
Yeah.
somewhere, but at least something to designate
Where the cemetery is.
cemetery went. Yeah, I mean, I think that would be respectful, but, you know, maybe the state of Indiana don't care. We don't want to spend $200 for a sign, you know?
Well, it's the law doesn't require it, but I understand why.
Well,
I understand
we
why.
don't even need laws to be historical and preservation in my book.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Bill, do you?
That could be one of those brown informational signs.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Make it
Unfortunately,
black and white so I can read it.
there you go.
Dark brown.
When they moved it to Crown Hill, did
Uh-huh.
you say? It was White something cemetery?
White cell.
White,
Cell. SELL.
White Cell. Okay, do they, and they sort of set it up like it was
Mhm.
before. Do they actually have a sign in Crown Hill that
Yes,
says
there's a
this
sign
is
out
the
at Crown
White
Hill
Cell
that says this is the
Cemetery?
White Cell Cemetery. Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yep, so you can go out, and then Crown Hill has an area that's called the Pioneer Area, where they, for several cemeteries that have been moved, that have been moved out there, then it's in that designated area for these historic cemeteries that are moved out there, and there's signs for all of those. Yeah, that's three of them out there.
Is that the west end of Crown Hill?
It's in the new section.
In the section north of 38th Street.
Yes.
And it's quite prominent. You read the
Especially because the rest of
monument
the,
there that gives you that information, you know, where this came from.
Yeah.
It's all quite clear.
But I'm out
And
here
it's-
now looking.
Yeah.
for it.
It's-
It's north of 38th Street,
Yes.
that part of Crown Hill, and it's the west end.
yeah, and especially for the cemetery, or the stones that are out there, look very, because it's in the new section, are very different than the stones that we put out, so it's very visible, and you can very much see it.
They actually take those stones?
Yes, they actually took those stones and moved them out there, yes. So, yep. All right, so if you're going to work on a site, there's several steps to work for. First is organizing your group. Now, as Catholics in his church, every kid who gets confirmed has to do volunteer work. I mean, I had to do it. So why not organize your kids in your church to come out and work on the cemetery? Have it as a part of the church, you know, the church group and stuff. But I also very much encourage to open it up to the general public, because there are cemetery advocates out there that if you put it in the paper, they come out of the woodwork. Delaware County did something like this, and their Center Township trustee wanted some help with working on the cemetery. And so he put an ad in the paper, said, hey, we're going to work on the cemetery this day if anybody wants to come out. Yeah, 30 people showed up. They've cleaned up all the cemeteries in his township and have actually expanded, now do the entire county. And every weekend, there are 30 to 35 people who travel around the county cleaning up cemeteries. So definitely getting things organized. But you also want someone in charge, because you don't want people nilly-willy going off on their own, because you want to have a plan and make sure you're doing things right. You want to research. You want to make sure you know what you're getting yourself into, how many people are supposed to be buried there, when was the cemetery started, because this is going to make a difference in some of the things that you do in the cemetery. So I'm a big fan of research and making sure you've got kind of all your documentation done. Definitely finding the other groups in your community that are doing work. If you wanted to know who those are, give me a call. I try to keep track of kind of who's doing what in the state, so that way if you're doing something in Lafayette or you're doing something in even in Marion County, I can tell you, well, hey, you need to get in touch with so-and-so because they're also doing cemetery preservation. Big fan of knowing your laws. We would hate for you to get arrested doing something you weren't supposed to be doing in the cemetery. I do have a list of laws in the state, so please feel free to grab those before you leave. So you got to know what's legal, what you're allowed to do, not allowed to do. Landowner permission. You can't go into a cemetery and do work without landowner permission. I mean, I can't go onto your property and paint your house without your permission. You can't go into the cemetery. So making sure that you know whoever, whether it's the diocese that owns it or local church, or if it's the township trustee's responsibility now, but making sure, again, get that word out and then have a plan. One of the biggest part of the plan is education and knowing what you're doing, so that you're not, again, doing some kind of work that I then put you in my PowerPoint presentation next time as please don't do this. You get your research before started. before starting, and you're going to have some costs and some supplies, again, depending on what you're going to do. If you're just cleaning up the brush, then maybe people will bring their own tools to cut down things. But if you're going to be doing restoration work on some big obelisks, you're going to need the equipment that is necessary to pick up the obelisk and move it and things like that. We want to determine the location of graves, whether and which direction. All right, pioneers, because we're Judeo-Christian, bury east to west. Your head faces the west, your feet face the east, and then the tombstone is on the west end of the grave. It's a headstone. The lettering of that tombstone faces the west also. Now, as Catholics, we like to be a little different. We face a crucifix. So you have to find the crucifix in the area and find out which direction that person would be facing so that their feet face the crucifix. Again, though, your wording is going to face away from the grave because it was considered bad luck to cross over someone's grave. So when you would walk in a cemetery, if I have a line of stones here and I can read all the who's buried there and the bodies are over there, I can walk along, read who these people are, and not walk over their grave. Now this changed about the 1880s, 1890s, and we've changed. And today when you go to someone's grave, the tombstone is at the headstone, is at the head of the grave, but you actually have to stand on the grave in order to read who's buried there. But you need to know that, so when you're doing restoration on a pioneer's cemetery or a pioneer's grave, to which direction the tombstone should be facing. So location of graves is important. And then you got to clear plants. There are historic plants in cemeteries, and some you'll want to keep because they're historic, but others you want to kind of clear out. Now I've got some examples to show you. And then you got to know what stones to fix, to replace, or just to leave alone. There are some stones that are in such bad shape that if you do any work to it, you're just going to damage it. And so understanding that, and that comes back to that knowledge. Some more things on that. Again, working with different groups. If you've got veterans in there, maybe working with the VFW or some group like that, maybe they'd give you some funds to help do the restoration on those graves. Again, you have different religious graves and ethnicity, and so maybe if you've got a bunch of German graves, you talk to the German Historical Society, and maybe they would do something with you guys on that. You have different types of gravestones, so knowing whether you have a marble or a granite is going to make a difference in what type of material you use to clean it. So you have to know that. And you got to look for your unmarked graves. And let me talk the grave orientation again. I got a great map, or here's a great example. So they put these stones back up, and here's the footstone, and then here's the body, and here's your headstone. But they put the headstone facing the wrong direction because the writing's here, so in order to read the person's information, I need to step on the grave. I actually want this stone turned around so I can walk along the back end of it and not step over anybody's grave. Now again, this is not something I think we deal with today or we worry about today, but our ancestors, that was an issue. So I've got a great drawing that a librarian did for me that shows the difference of how it is today. So you've got the body. This is going to be the east, this is the west. Here's your tombstone, your inscription's over here. You're standing there to read it. Today, here's the body facing east to west. Here's the tombstone, but you got to stand here in order to read it. So if anybody wants a copy of this, please let me know. But I had a librarian who heard my talk, and so she made that for me, and it's very visual. All right, so what's something you need to bring? Natural brushes. You do not want to do any cleaning. You don't want a plastic brush, or you don't want a brush with color. If you go into a brush with color and clean the stone, you're going to have blue or orange specks on the stone. A bucket with water. I'm a big fan of gloves. And then tools to remove the growth. Anything that you use on the stone, if you cannot use on your skin, don't bring. So metal's bad. Metal actually scratches the stone, so we encourage, there's plastic like putty knives. Those work really good to remove algae, wood, things like that, to remove the algae. And basically what you do is it's 1 part ammonia, 4 parts water. You put it in a spray bottle. You spray the stone down, scrub, clean with fresh water, and you keep doing that until it's clean. It's a lot of elbow grease. But before you get started, and never ever ever use metal brushes. Bleach is bad. It makes the stone very pretty white at the beginning, but if you ever put too much bleach in your laundry, it turns that yellow color. It'll do that to the stone. After sitting out in that sun for a while, it'll start to turn the stone this very bizarre yellow color, and you can't get it out. So don't do that. No acids. I've had people say, well, you can use muriatic acid. Well, that just eats the stone away, and eventually you're not going to be able to read their inscriptions. The stone will never look like it did originally. It's not supposed to. It's going to have what we call a patina, a nice little stained look to it. It's going to have that. It's an old stone. That's just what it's supposed to have. And we don't want to use cement or anything else that's going to damage the stone. So we basically say if you can't use it to your skin. So ammonia, you're going to stink, but ammonia you can put on your skin and it doesn't do anything. It's not going to damage you. Water and some good elbow grease will get you what you need. This is a good example of kind of what that'll do. It'll, depending on what the algae is, of how much is going to get it off, but yes, it'll get most of it off. So the first thing you need to do is make sure your stone is safe to clean. So the first thing I always do is you go up to the stone and just wiggle it like this. If it's going to fall over with you rubbing on it, don't clean it. You need to stabilize it first. If it's sugaring, which is you go up to the stone and literally go like this, and if a bunch of stone comes off in your hand, that's called sugaring. It's just a bad stone. It was just a bad quality of stone. Between that and the acid rain, it is decaying, and you're just going to cause more problems than if you just left it alone.
And that's from marble.
Marble predominantly, but it also limestone sugar. When you go up to a limestone, you're going to get some off, but I'm talking like you get a handful off of it. Yeah, so limestone does it, marble does it, but the granite doesn't do that. But yeah, that's predominantly from those two. And you got to know your material. If you've got a polished granite stone and it just needs to be cleaned off, Windex works. But actually Windex has ammonia in it, but Windex works just fine. You don't need to do as much with that. If you have a sandstone, which are stones that you get down in southern Indiana, you don't use ammonia, it's just water. So you just need to know your materials. Again, those classes, if you take some classes, that'll definitely help you. Use a natural brush, water and ammonia, and you rinse, rinse, rinse. So it's, again, it's time consuming. It is something that takes a while, but it's something that makes a big difference in what the cemetery looks like. And you might have there's more advanced restoration, you might need training. So if you have stones that are broken in 3 pieces and you need to epoxy them back together, you need to take a class because you can't just use anything to put those together. I have seen people use Gorilla Glue. That does not work well. I've seen people use cement. It looks bad and then also doesn't hold it together and it breaks apart pretty quickly. Where there's certain epoxies that are made for stones and in a certain way, and there's a process. It's not hard. Everybody in here could do it, except for me. I'm not allowed to touch the stones anymore. The people at the class tease because every time I seem to touch the stones, I break them. So I stand around and just watch. But it's not something that it's not something difficult. It's something that you could definitely do, definitely make a difference in your cemetery. All right, but what if you can't do restoration? If you're like me, you're not allowed to touch, or you have a group of seniors who just can't do it, or you've got a group of young kids. Because there's certain things you don't want the young kids doing. So there's other things that you could do preservation-wise or in your cemetery to make a difference. And I think the biggest thing to do is maintenance. And I'm just talking about some very basic things, like this shrub line here. Every time I go out to the cemetery, it gets a little bit farther out. The mower doesn't go quite as far in, and pretty soon it's going to be taking over those back stones. So making sure that every time you mow back as far as you need to, and keeping that, that brush taken care of. It's easy. Something you only probably have to do like once a year, but it's just something that you need to make sure you keep up with. Taking care of plants that have gone awry. This is a yucca plant. Yucca plants were put on cemeteries. They're a historic plant. It keeps the soul in the ground, is what our pioneer ancestors thought. And I don't know if you can see the stone that's right in here. He is being eaten by the yucca plants. So getting this cut back is going to make a big difference on the stone. Now I'm a big fan of leaving historic plants in the cemetery, but you need to balance the difference between the plant and the stone. And so you could, cut back a lot of this, and still keep some of it so that it's still there on the cemetery or on the grave, but you can still see the stone and it's not damaging the stone or eating the stone. This one is a gopher or groundhog that has gone awry. Groundhogs love cemeteries because it is disturbed ground. You know, there's been some digging, so it's easier for them to dig, but there's nobody in there bugging them. There's not a lot of people in and around, and so they are dangerous, especially pioneer cemeteries or historic cemeteries, because they don't have vaults. Vaults weren't required by law until the 1930s, and they're actually not required anymore today, but they were required in the 1930s, but you know, today they're not even required. A lot of cemeteries, they have that as their rule, but it's not a state law. And so historically, you know, all you've got is a 6-foot hole, you got a 3-foot coffin, and then 3 feet of dirt. And that coffin has rotted over the years and has lost integrity, and so it's easy for that groundhog to get in there and get things moved around. Unfortunately, I have had to pick up human remains off the surface from when a groundhog goes in, because they dig out stuff, and if the body's in the way, they'll dig it out and get it out of the way. So taking care of those animals that are in the cemetery that are causing problems is huge. This cemetery is pretty bad, and they need to get that taken care of. And then this is that mower, and so we were talking about the mowers coming through. You see the line that goes through here? That is from the mower deck. Every time it's going past, it just rubs up against it. Eventually, that stone's going to snap there. And so then you have a repair to do. Instead of just making sure that the mower guy is just a few inches away from the stone, and so talking to whoever your mowing company is, I think, is a huge thing, and making sure that they're not getting too close. Now, it might require weed eating. I know that takes time. We discourage weed killer around the stone, because two things. One is the weed killer is a salt-based, the salt that gets into the ground and comes up through this soil into the stone and then starts eating the stone away. And then also, if you take up too much of the grass and stuff around the stone, all you're left with is dirt. That grass is what keeps the dirt in place, and you'll get erosion, and eventually it'll wash out, and then you'll have problems with the stone leaning. So that does take some hand labor. You're going to have to go through with a weed eater and stuff like that periodically and do that. But doing that once a month and mowing the rest of the time, at least it'll prevent somebody from coming up like that, and eventually it is going to snap that stone. All right, and then some other projects that you can work on that you can definitely have the kids with confirmation, CYO, things like that, or even some of the adults in the cemetery, is cleaning up the yard. Just making sure every week that limbs that get blown down from the wind and from things like that, if you've got people who've put trash in the cemetery, getting that always cleaned up. You can do a reading of the tombstones, getting a list of who is buried in the cemetery, where they're buried, kind of what's on the tombstone, and then giving that information to the library, make sure that the parish office has it, so that way when someone comes in to do their genealogy, you can say, well, so-and-so's buried out here. History of individuals, it's a great way, who are the leaders of your church? They're buried in your cemetery, so doing a history of them so that you always know your history and know who's been important in your community. Flags on the veteran stones, making sure that at Labor Day or at Memorial Day, 4th of July, things like that there are flags on the stones, and that they're picked up afterwards. I hate it when I go out to cemeteries and the flags have been put out, that's great, but it's 3 months later and they're all looking horrible, and then they're falling over on the ground, which I was always taught you don't let this flag touch the ground, so these are laying all over the ground. So if you're going to put flags out, make sure that you take them up when it's time, so that that's respectful. Websites, we talked about how do I know that where the cemetery is and things like that. Almost everybody's using the web anymore, so getting stuff on the website I think is a positive thing. And then some signs of the cemetery, whether it's interpretive signs, who owns the cemetery, where do I go for more information, things like that, I think are projects that you can do even if you can't do the restoration. So it's a good start of a project for the community, even if it's not a full restoration. Because all of this stuff, little by little, is what you're going to need to do to kind of combat time and things like that. All right, so there is all you need to know, well, for the moment, all you need to know for the moment about cemetery projects and restoration. More questions? Yes, Bill.
Those cemeteries that I would go looking for, which were on the USGS
Mhm.
maps, are those private property then?
Okay, so who's the owner is basically how do you find out the owner of a cemetery? The first thing I always do is you go to the auditor's office And for that parcel, who's paying property taxes? So if there's somebody paying property, if it says Bill Selms paying property taxes, then you're the owner of that cemetery. It may say, St. Anne's Church, and they're exempt. So they're not paying property taxes, but St. Anne's Church is the owner of that cemetery. Let's say St. Anne's Church doesn't exist anymore. They went defunct, there's nobody around, then that becomes the township trustees' property. So those are I always start with the auditor's office. Sometimes, though, there's cemeteries kind of fall through the cracks and we're not really sure, and it's this bizarre thing. But most cemeteries you can find through that auditor's office.
Now, when you talk about the township trustee, does that become the property of the public property?
So it'd become public property, just like if it were the government, just like it's the post office or the fire department. And
Township is township government.
yes.
But not all those cemeteries would fall under the jurisdiction of, or the ownership of the township trustee.
No.
So what's the difference?
Only ones that fall under the jurisdiction of the township trustee is no taxes being paid on the property, no organization that doesn't pay property taxes, that's a viable organization to care for it, and is established before the February 1939 date. Then they become the township trustee's responsibility. But if it's the city cemetery, theoretically the city's a viable organization, and so they're the owner of that. Or I'm the farmer who owns 160 acres and there's a cemetery on my property and I'm paying property taxes, then that's mine. Or it's the church's property or whatever. So it's going to be one of those owners. So it's going to be either government, whether it's state, city, county, township. It's going to be a non-for-profit, a cemetery association, a church, or it's going to be privately owned. And there are corporations too that'd be privately owned too.
But you were talking earlier about moving cemeteries.
Mm-hmm.
Before a cemetery is moved, of course, you said they have to go to
A court, yeah.
court, but is there a review process through DNR?
No.
106 review or anything like that?
Okay, so he wanted there was a process called 106. We're the State Preservation Office, and anytime state or federal funds or state or federal permits are required, then they have to go through our office for a review. It's called Section 106. No, they do not have to go through us unless they're using state or federal funds. So when NDOT decides to move a cemetery, that has to go through a 106 process. But Walmart decides to move the cemetery, they don't even have to notify us that they moved it. Which is a problem for me because I can't update my cemetery registry if I don't know, but they don't have to notify us. The coal companies, which is our biggest mover of cemeteries in Indiana, is the coal companies. They don't have to work through us. They have their own laws, and they work through the Division of Reclamation, who is in DNR, so they come down and they talk to me about it, but they don't have to notify us. So, yeah, and we don't get any say in it. We do with NDOT, or when there's Section 106, we can recommend archaeology, which we prefer to a funeral home director, but in the end they could choose a funeral home director if they wanted to, but we could just recommend that they go archaeology. So yeah, it's not as much oversight on our part as we might like, but that's just the law's written, that it's through the health department and the court system. Yes, ma'am.
On these cemeteries that the trustee is responsible for, could a person actually go in and buy the cemetery back from the trustee, or take over the maintenance of the cemetery? Let's say they had some relatives buried in it, and they're really interested in the preservation of it, so they decide, well, I'd like to be responsible for the cemetery. They can do that.
Yeah, so she asked, can you buy the cemetery back from the trustee? You could buy the cemetery back from a trustee. You could go in and say, look, my family, these 8 plots are my family, I want to care for those. And I don't know any trustee who wouldn't say, go ahead, because then that's less tax, it's less money that they have to spend. So yeah, they definitely could. Buying a cemetery is kind of tough because you've got, setting up like new graves and things like that is possible, but there's a lot of hoops to jump through, because we want to make sure that the cemetery, you're the good person, you want to care for it, but then when you pass away, are your kids and grandkids going to want to take care of it? So there's all these things that you need to set up in order to make sure that you're setting enough money aside to do future preservation, future. You have to have a little bit of money and set up some kind of a like a perpetual care fund or something like that to do that. So, yes. So it's definitely working with the trustee and possibly even doing it that way and saying, hey, I'll just, help you with the finances of it. Because then it's always being in trust and things like that.
You mentioned earlier, like coal companies, they have their own laws
Mhm.
when it comes to moving cemeteries.
Yes.
That sort of thing. Who controls the nature of those rules and regulations that they abide by?
Okay, so who controls the coal company's rules and regulations? Well, it comes through two ways. One is that the state law has passed that talks about things to clarify and to maybe if it's not clear in the law, that we'll do what's called an administrative code. And then that is like the state agency that's responsible for it. And in Indiana, it's the Division of Reclamation out of DNR. And so then they'll have specific rules too that they'll say, all right. And this when we do specific rules, we have to go through the Natural Resources Commission. It's open to the public. We can't just make the rules. We have to put it out for public hearings and things like that. But if the state says they can move the cemetery, and it's just as vague as that, but you want to kind of come up with what are the steps for that, then you would go through the Natural Resources Commission. They would kind of create these rules, and then it would be open to the public for comments, and then be passed. And I don't know if it's 3 or 5 years, but every so often, those administrative codes have to be re-heard through the Natural Resources Commission. Because I have one through Cemetery Registry that deals with probing in cemeteries and looking for covered tombstones, and we have a rule about that. And we just had to go through another hearing where it's been a rule for about 7 years, and so we just did another hearing to let the general public come in, and if they don't like it because it doesn't work or they want it to be stricter, whatever, people can comment on it, and then the Natural Resources Commission actually then adopts those rules. So, and those are available on the websites.
And then by them adopting these rules, the majority of private corporations, developers, whoever, this is the model they should be following.
Yes, it'll give very specifics of what they have to provide. So then that way there's a consistency. If I'm asking you for this information, then when he just needs to move a cemetery, we're asking for the same information. So it's not subjective and stuff like that. So that's a very consistent listing of what's required, and that's what those rules are for. So. One more question, yeah.
Is there any restrictions on where they can move the cemetery to?
They have to move it into an active cemetery. So they can't move it, don't say that. They could move it to an area, like let's say we want to move it from here over to there, but then that area would have to be created under the law to become a cemetery. And to create a new cemetery, part of it has to do with the local health department, is that property good for burials? Because if it's close to the water table, if it's this, it's that, if it's in the floodplain, you're not going to want burials there. So it's got to be in an active cemetery, but that could be a brand new cemetery, but it would be then done that way. So yeah, there's a whole list of rules for moving. It's not cheap and it's not easy, but it's not supposed to be, because we shouldn't just be willy-nilly moving people. And so there's a whole process that if you decide to move a cemetery, you've got to think through all of this and make sure that's exactly what you're going to want to do.
I guess my question was, what about, I hear about this often on TV, but what about if it were like an Indian burial ground they found, as opposed to just what we would consider a regular cemetery? Does the same rules apply?
So she asked if the same rules apply to Native American burial grounds as to cemeteries. Sort of. It also, you have the same rules of some of the cemetery, but then you also have federal law. It's called NAGPRA. It's called Native American Grave Protection Repatriation Act, NAGPRA. And what that has to do with is that it allows consultation by Native American tribes to what happens with those remains. And we get that all the time. When we get people, you're digging for a foundation and there's human remains. So you find human remains, call our office. You have 2 days to call our office. We contact the coroner's office. And what we're going to do there is the first thing we're going to do is find out, are these new burials? Is this a crime scene, or is this old burials? So new burials is anything after 1949. So if we think that person's been dead for 100 years or 1,000 years or whatever, then it's no longer the coroner's issue, they don't care, and then it becomes under ours. And then we work with the landowner, what's the best process? If it's pioneer or it's European American graves, then we start working with, okay, are you going to leave the grave there, make it a cemetery, or are you going to move it? But if it's Native American graves, then it gets into this, again, this NAGPRA, where we have to contact the historic tribes of the area and talk to them and have them help with consultation. So.
Is there, is it the tribe that you think is it's the burial ground up, or what if the tribe is, there isn't any tribe?
That is the prickly issue is the Miami Indians of today. Is there a genetic link to that tribe of that person that's there? Because it may have been the Miami or the Potawatomi, or it may not have been. And so that's why NAGPRA gets sticky, and why I am so happy I don't have to do with that. Our director of our division, who's an archaeologist, he's getting to do with all the NAGPRA issues in the office, and I am happy to have him do that. So yeah, as soon as we realize that they're Native American graves, it goes off my table, goes over to my director's table, and he gets the one that gets to deal with it. Because again, it gets very involved, and it has to do with what's the likelihood that this is this tribe, and so that becomes an issue.
Doesn't come up much anymore.
Oh, it does. It comes up all the time. We average about one accidental discovery. That's what we call it. When you dig and you didn't mean to find something, it's an accidental discovery. We average about one a month. Sometimes more, sometimes less. In the winter, you don't find as many because people aren't digging, but in the summer, when there's a lot of construction, you'll find we average about one a month. Sometimes it's that lost cemetery that we knew was out there somewhere, but we didn't know exactly where, and sometimes it's graves that we had no clue it was there until they were dug up.
So actually, the first person probably that gets involved is the coroner.
The coroner in our office, yep. Yes, and that's the thing. We want to make sure that it's not a case that they need to deal with. So that's the first thing we do is we deal with the coroner's office and a professional called a physical anthropologist, and they are specialists in bones. If you guys have ever seen the television show Bones, she's a physical anthropologist, and they have the ability to look at a skeleton and tell you gender, race, probable age of death, sometimes with the cause of death, and how long those bones have been buried. So that's their skill. We actually have one of the best physical anthropology programs in the United States at the University of Indianapolis. The guy who's in charge of it is Dr. Naraki, and he's amazing, and he is one of 60 licensed physical anthropologists in the country. He's amazing. So every time you see, like if you see the helicopter of the news going over a scene and they're like, physical anthropologists or scientists go out to the human remains, that's Dr. Naraki and his students, and they'll go out and do an analysis of those remains to try to figure out, again, does the coroner care, or is it then become under our jurisdiction? No. Yep.
In my interest in German Catholic cemeteries, I've discovered that there's a particular type of marker which is metal.
Does it look blue?
Well, no.
Okay.
No. It's either cast iron.
The crucifix.
Yes. It's a crucifix?
These are headstones.
Okay.
So they're either wrought iron, they're cast iron, and then the later manifestation in this tradition, and I've seen it in Du Bois County, threaded pipe.
Yes, I've seen the threaded pipes.
Okay. The threaded pipe is a descendant of the wrought iron, and then the cast iron is 19th century. So I've done all the Catholic cemeteries in my beloved Franklin County, and there's quite a few of those, and I think there might be some at St. Joseph, some wrought iron, I'm not sure. But there was one which was being destroyed by the lawnmower. So I dug it up. I didn't ask anybody what. The way I look at it is, I'm going to do something good. Why get a no? So I dug it up. So it was a cross, wrought iron, 4 feet high, and the cross piece was about 18 inches to 2 feet. So I dug it up. I took it home. I cleaned it up, and I found some junk metal, and my dad welded it on. I restored it, and then I went back, and because it was just sitting in the ground, so it had been buried,
Yeah.
so that the cross piece was about a foot off the
Yep.
ground, and the lawnmower kept hitting it, so that the arms of the cross were going back and
Yeah.
back. So I mixed up some concrete, and they set it. That was 32 years ago, and I painted everything too. So it needs some more paint, but the concrete base is holding up, and it was much better condition now than
Yep.
when I saw it over 30 years ago.
You did everything right except for ask for landowner permission. But no, I mean, and that's what it takes. It takes individuals caring and making that difference. So the metal, and it is the German Catholics who love these metal. I've seen a lot of them as crucifixes or crosses. I've seen a couple actually headstones that are made out of metal. There's another metal that you'll see that as you look across the cemetery, it looks blue. It's called white bronze or zinc. This was popular in the late 1800s. They were made out of Connecticut, and then there was a distributor out of Detroit. So we get a lot here in Indiana, and they were sold as the advertisement as a cheap way to honor your dead. Well, who wants to be seen as cheap when they're honoring their dead? So they didn't last very long, selling wise, but they last a long time now. I mean, if you go up to them now, but they're hollow. So if you see one of these, you just, like I said, it's this blue tint. Once you see one, you'll know it. You go up and you can knock on it, and it's hollow because just the way it's made out of. And then there was these plates that you could replace the plates, and for different information. But those are the kind of the two you get. But it's the good German hardy stock that want their cast iron.
They usually have a plate.
Right,
with the
which
name
is
of
stamped
the
sheet metal,
deceased
right?
Yeah.
Which is often gone.
on
Yes.
it. I think in this area, since we don't have large Czech cemeteries, the Germans have a monopoly on that style. You go out to Iowa and states beyond the Missouri, the Catholic cemetery, especially if it's a Czech settlement there, that they have the same designs. Probably I think the biggest collection of those metal markers is in the town whose name I cannot remember now in Iowa. The importance was that late 19th century, early 20th century, the composer Centennial had come from Bohemia, and he lived there for some time. Well, that cemetery must have maybe 30 or 40 of those markers. I've never seen anywhere else. Usually a couple from 1870s and 80s. That's usually what the date is that you found.
Yeah.
And since it was it still is a Czech settlement, Czech Catholic settlement, that they continue to use the same kind of marker for several generations.
And that's where, some of that research will help. And because, again, while you have Catholic, we're all similar there, we have different backgrounds and different ethnicities. And so, the Czech German stones are going to be different than the Irish Catholic or the French Catholic. And so you've got some knowing that research is going to help with what you do. If you get some of the Eastern European individuals coming over about the 1880s, 1890s, they're going to put these ceramic photos on their stone, regardless of religion. So you see it in the Jewish cemetery as well as the Catholic cemetery because it has to do with their ethnicity, not their religion. And having the ceramic photos are very popular. Again, made in Chicago, so they're really popular in Indiana. And so knowing this stuff is going to help you as you do restoration, can explain kind of what's going on. And you've got this great Czech Catholic cemetery that maybe even if historically you don't even know is there, or if you don't know that it was a Czech community, it will explain why you have so many crosses of this metal cross. So this is why I'm big a fan of that research.
Those cast iron markers in Oldenburg were locally manufactured.
Fantastic, yeah.
His name's on it, the model number, and then oddly it says Oldenburg, Indiana, and then it says United States in French. I don't know why.
So as you talk about, the marker, the name of the guy who made the markers on that. Lots and lots of stones, you will find the name of the marker, the carver, at the bottom of the stone. So these artisans, this was advertising. So I went out to the cemetery and I saw this beautiful, metal stone or this great carving, and I was like, I wonder who did that. You'd have that person's name on there so you would know who to get in touch with in order to show you the, that to give you more stones. Okay, I've got about 5 minutes left. We can continue to ask questions. I want to see if I can find that picture of that cemetery where I showed you the beginning. I think it's in one of my talks here. Nope, that's not it. You guys don't care about the Underground Railroad. So if you've got questions, any more questions, I'll be happy to answer them. But I'll see if I have this before and after. I thought I had it in here, but no, looks like I don't have it in here. Oh, bummer. It's really quite impressive. Again, the before and after difference is amazing. But any more questions?
Why did you choose that for your?
The screensaver? I think it's funny that they spell their cemeteries 2 different ways. I switch it out a lot. I've got one that's the Paris Cemetery, and then it says dead end. The road's a dead end, but so I have that periodically comes up. I find humor in cemeteries. To me, they're not macabre places. They're beautiful places that you can have a picnic in and then laugh about too. So I just was amused that they can't figure out how to spell their own name. So I change it out a lot. Yes.
I've had a number of cemeteries we clean or scout to make funds because a lot of the people don't want to take care of them, or they're elderly, and they'll have overgrowth and various other things. And then we can sometimes set stones and reset other items for them. So it's a nice little fundraiser for the boys, but it also gets them out to be able to do some things that you wouldn't normally do in a cemetery, rather than knock stones down. They're
exactly
doing the right thing. So trying to, as a role model, teach them right there. But I had one scout that came to me and he wanted to do his Eagle project, and we went to Crown Hill and he did 1,400 Revolutionary and Civil War stones. We pulled them all and put stone below them because they sunk down to the ground about 4 feet deep. And we got the chemicals out of California. Of course, this is the 3rd largest cemetery in the nation, sitting here in Indianapolis, and the government kind of oversees a lot of it, but they kind of neglected for years that particular section of about 1.5 acres. And so they were overwhelmed to have somebody interested in doing it. And we went out and did that, and I was out there the other day, and out of those 1,400 stones, I think there's like 2 have resunk down. They're about that far out of the ground right now, but all the rest, we got them all in line, and they look sharp. But if somebody would like to do a project like that, Crown Hill is very good to work with.
Crown Hill's great to work with.
They care about the cemetery, but I found everything but them positive. I've never had a problem with any of my scouts, and we go to do projects.
Yes.
They are very nice.
They are fantastic to work with, and scouts I think are fantastic. We do, I get a lot of scouts who call me and want information. So either scout group or for their Eagle project or anything like that. I actually had one Girl Scout for her, I think they call it the Daisy, is what their version of the Eagle is. I think it's the Daisy. And so having scouts, either Girl Scouts, Boy Scouts, is an amazing way to get, again, you get them in the cemetery, you get them doing positive stuff in there, so that, again, when they're 17, they don't decide tipping over stones is fun. And I think that's a very positive way to do it.
You find lots of cemeteries where there's a lot of vandalism.
Yeah.
Most, and I can't say it's just boys maybe, but boys do like to do damage and characteristical, break windows. I mean, I'm a boy, I've been that all my whole life, I'm going to continue to be a boy. It's the nature of boys, and that's part of the habit.
Yep.
If you've got role models and people that try to teach them, even though they've done wrong, try to get them on the right track, get them back. Maybe later on as a future adult, they'll be a little better, but the problem is a lot of people just don't care, and they just buzz on and care less about the youth. But
and give them some positive focus for that energy.
yeah, so, you know, anybody that ever wants to do anything for Crown Hill, they're wide open. They're nice people.
They are fantastic to work with.
Would you find the slide you have showing the burials? I think there's an explanation right under those drawings of why the east and west was so important.
It's just I don't know if she said that, but it's because we're Judeo-Christian, and then when Jesus comes again, that we can rise rise to meet him.
It's easier getting up,
I guess it's.
since he comes up from the east, is the story I've heard.
Yes.
Is that what this
Yeah,
is?
that's what it is, because he's supposed to come from the east, and so you would be able to sit up to greet him. Is the why we bury that way. Because again, Catholics we will also bury towards the crucifix, so it's either east, west, or towards the crucifix, but the same concept as the crucifix representing with Jesus, that you can sit up to greet him. So. But again, a north-south burial might indicate someone who's out of favor with the church, and I've seen that. Somebody's excommunicated, but still wants to be buried like with their family, and the church will be buried that way. So, all right. Well, I want to thank everyone for coming. I'll be around. I've got some handouts here. Feel free to that. You can call me if you've got questions next week or something like that. Please feel free to give me a holler. And again, if anybody wants that. One of those free spots of the class, please let me know, and I will be happy to get you contact information about that.